Pax vobiscum. Welcome back, one and all, to another short story reading. Today we are going to be reading the story Colony of the Unfit by Manfred A. Carter. Similar to Nightmare on the Nose, which we read earlier, this short story is taken from a science fiction magazine from 1944, actually. It came from the magazine Planet Stories, and it was from the winter 1944 edition. I'm excited to read this story. It does have a very interesting theme, I do think, and written in the style of the times, it is fascinating to look back and see what people perceived of our solar system at the time based off of the information that they had, versus how we sort of look at science fiction for our solar system based off of the information that we have now as our technology evolved. So always a fascinating look back into the perceptions of people of the past. And so without further ado, Colony of the Unfit by Manfred A. Carter. John Greeley looked at Hilda's freshly gloved artificial hand as she adjusted her notebook to a clip concealed in the palm. The hand fascinated him horribly. Beauty should never be crippled. She sensed his morbid stare, but smiled and rose gracefully, saying, "Okay, boss, let's go." She flashed bantering eyes at her editor. With a last pat of her heavily ringed right hand on the rich rolling waves of blonde hair that were always in place. The startling pale beauty of her young face was contrasted by glowing dark brown eyes. Theirs was a comfortable friendship, this of the young editor and his society staff and secretary, but a limited one. He said gruffly, "Let me carry the rat-a-tat." "No, you're the dignity. I'm the beast of burden. Come on, hurry. We've only 5 minutes to reach the district hospital." John slipped on his transparent all-weather coat and helped Hilda with hers. His reddish-brown hair flipped in the March wind as they stepped out from the Daily Home Recorder building. His almost boyishly round cheeks glowed with color. Hilda liked the way his shoulders snapped up as he faced the cold. She liked the way he took her arm, but she must always be casual. "Do you suppose it's just another rumor?" she asked as they stepped into the low, cigar-shaped car. "Looks like straight dope to me. The Universal News Service is pretty conservative." "How could things have changed so while we were away? It doesn't seem like the same world. Those men in Washington must be mad." "I know, Hilda, but perhaps we are the ones who are out of step. This is the day of directed evolution." "But John, how horrible! To take all those sick folks and banish them on a space tramp." John drove past the old wooden houses of their small city, and then let out speed on the highway before he answered, "The leader says that it is what we should do. Harden our emotions for the sake of a better race. You and I are in the minority. Those years on the moon trip have left us out of date." They were silent for a little while before she continued, "Do you really suppose we are in the minority? The people who listen in our rat-a-type service seem just about as they did before we went away. Their letters prove that. I saw an old lady's scrapbook the other day, of her clippings. I read it through because I had been wondering how much of the printed recording was ever reread. Most people are content to glance at the screen when the news first comes on. She had saved the old type's sentimental items, just as an old lady would have 5 or 10 years ago." "Yes, the small towns are slow to change. That's why they hate the little news services like ours. Prepared news hastens the new day." "Do you suppose they'll talk to us?" "They'll have to," he said grimly. "With all those folks watching and listening in, I wonder what the patients think about the new idea, or if they know." "Where do you think they will be sent? Why don't the authorities just put them to sleep with a lethal drug?" "Search me, honey. Well, here we are." Their street roller drew up silently before a huge grey building in the open country, and John turned the magnetic parking control. They stepped out from the grass-lined curb, and John pushed the moving sidewalk half-speed handle, sliding them quickly up to the entrance. It opened automatically, and in a moment they were standing before a large silver reception screen. A white-haired doctor in his long surgical gown glowed rapidly into focus before them. His eyes darted at John like the incision of a lancet. "What's the press want this morning?" We'd like an interview on the Universe news story. Hilda held her radatype transmitter open toward the screen, secure in the crook of her arm while she made private stenographic notes on the pad. Every home in the Brownville section, which happened to be tuned in, was seeing the doctor, and he suddenly realized it enough to smile slightly. He inwardly cursed the freedom of the press in small towns, but remarked with forced graciousness, "I'll have a nurse conduct you to the surgery. We can talk while I supervise some minor operations." "Fine, fine." They walked past the mental case wards in silence. It had been 50 years since the most degenerate of those poor unfortunates had been allowed to vociferate their wild discords. Hypnosis and drugs had achieved permanent quiet at last, but there was still a low percentage of actual cures. Beyond these wards they came to the surgical division, and presently sat with Dr. Henderson in a small circular screened room, where a dozen operations were simultaneously shown. He hardly glanced at them, but kept his eyes constantly on the moving screen before him, touching buttons occasionally before making some brief comment into the transmitter. John ignored his seeming lack of attention. "What about this story that the Central Medical Division is moving all these patients out on a spaceship?" "Some wild rumor. Nothing in it." "Any objection to our taking a round of observation?" "No, go ahead. Might as well do it now. We can finish the interview later. I want to concentrate on that brain section transfer. It's rather tricky." They stepped into an observation car and slid slowly around the overhead track, looking down on crowded wards below. "John, there is something happening here. Look at the patients' faces. They're afraid." "It does seem to be a lot of activity." "Let's slide down into that convalescent ward and see what they have to say." "Okay, sister, but you know it's forbidden. I'll probably get thrown out and reported." They had hardly stepped out of the slide when a group of white-gowned orderlies came down the next corridor. Hilda saw them and whispered tensely, "Here, sit in this wheelchair and I'll visit you. Help me fold our coats so that you can sit on them." John obeyed and lolled back in the chair, winking at her before he half closed his eyes. The orderlies wheeled in a low carrier, piled high with transparent plastic overcoats, old-fashioned sweaters, woolen mackinaws, and rubber raincoats, any sort of outdated covering. Most of the patients in these district hospitals were poor, and largely living in the meagre comforts of the early part of the century. They made no protest, but donned their variegated assortment of coverings, and lined up obediently to march out. "Let's go with them," Hilda whispered. "Quick, behind those screens and into the end of the line," he directed. "The press joins the army of the decrepitude." "John, there are hundreds of ambulance planes outside." "Got your transmitter on?" "Yes, it's been on all the time." A white-faced man ahead of them began to struggle between two guards as they reached the open air. A male nurse walking behind them deftly thrust a large hypodermic into the patient's arm, while the orderlies held him and pushed back his sleeve. The rebellious one quieted and was carried into one of the planes. There were a few other struggles of resistance. Here and there a patient ran a few yards before being caught and subdued. For the most part, the unhappy crowd showed only a quiet, despairing obedience. John urged in a low, worried tone, "Let's make a dash for our roller. This is no place for you." "No, this is horrible. We must see it through. Pretend to be sick and go along." "Don't be sentimental, Hilda. Get ready to run for it when we pass that wall." He took her right hand in his left and snapped off the radatype. "Now!" She had no choice, but, as they ran around the corner of the wall, they crashed into a group of surgeons coming toward the planes. "Hold them!" cried Dr. Henderson. "They've done enough damage already. Put them on the plane. Perhaps we can claim the first broadcast was an impersonation if they're gone." John broke one pair of spectacles and started one nosebleed dripping down a doctor's immaculate gown, but muscles haven't much chance against the rigidity serum. He yielded to the hypodermic and did not come to during the brief ambulance ride, nor while they were being loaded onto the battered old space tramp. Hilda continued to scribble her antiquated shorthand surreptitiously on the pad, but they had appropriated her radatype. She was not given the rigidity serum until she was strapped onto a sleeping shelf in the ship. Only a small group of officers in the control room were conscious of the sudden inertia strain when the rockets thundered out through the Earth's atmosphere. All the patients were mercifully in the long sleep that would seem like a minute of time, when awakened after months of racing through silent outer space. John felt the prick of the needle that awakened him to consciousness through a vague haze of half-forgetfulness. Suddenly he remembered and tore feverishly at the straps holding him down. In a moment he was free from their restraint, but laughing in vexation at his forgetfulness when his exertions threw him upward, he hung suspended in the cabin space, dangling from the strap still held in his right hand. He had forgotten they had left gravity behind. He pulled himself down and seized the sleeping shelf with his left hand. Clinging to it, he sidled along toward the forward port. Patients, under their straps as he had been, were slowly coming back to life, and they stared at him frightened or amused or indifferent according to their conditions. The attendants had gone from the cabin. At last John could see through a 6-foot plate of hardened glass. The view was slightly hazy and unreal. Below their plunging ship was the red planet, still a vague sphere. The orange glow, familiar to Earth telescopes, was gone now. The vast stretches of red desert and darker marsh areas became faintly distinguishable. Those regular lines of water channels from the opposing polar caps became visible to the naked eye, and were far less geometrical than Earth pictures had shown them. It was summer in the northern hemisphere, and its polar cap had receded. The one previous expedition to this dying planet had been given little publicity, and John was fascinated by the view before him. At last they entered the thin atmosphere. Instant by instant the deserts and low, rounded hills grew visible. Lines of vegetation along the water channels turned green. Finally, the forward jets of the ship roared, and John was crushed against the rear cabin wall by the change of speed. He crawled painfully back to his sleeping shelf and strapped himself in. The rumor was true. He was on a ship of doom. And Hilda, where was she? Had she escaped? There was nothing he could do. The ship screamed into the thicker lower atmosphere, and vibrations penetrated her thick hull. John's memory of previous space trips told him they were nearly ready to land. There was hardly a jar as they grounded and tilted slowly to rest. Sleepy-eyed orderlies came in unsteadily, affected by the lighter gravity. They were pushing a truck full of helmets and oxygen masks, which they deftly adjusted to the patients. The men in this cabin were all able to walk and were soon outside the airlock. Following them came stretcher-bearers, street-roller ambulances, men on crutches, and even a few of the more demented in glass-sight water jackets, from which they peered with dull eyes as if they had been drugged. Hilda burst free from the second group of women and cried, "John! Oh, John, I'm so glad I found you!" She threw her arms around him and pillowed her head on his shoulder. He held her happily, his blood racing. This was a different girl from the hard and casual newspaper woman. Suddenly she recovered. "Sorry. I guess I have the old-time jitters. I'll try not to let it happen again." She covered her gloved left hand with her right and turned away. "See, what a hopeless, pitiful mob," she said after a moment. "Yes, and I wonder what next. I've read that most of the old dwelling places are underground. The Martians made their last stand against desolation in cave cities." "Oh, there's an entrance." "Yes, and here come the guards." The long procession of the lame, the blind, and the sick was soon in weaving motion over red sand toward a great metal door set into a low cliff. Their oxygen helmets bobbed almost comically. There were few guards, and these made little attempt at restraint. John and Hilda went hand in hand toward a group in the lead, the seemingly able-bodied ones. "I suppose most of these are alcoholics and drug addicts," John remarked absently as they followed. "Maybe this will really cure them. They certainly can't escape or bribe their way to intoxication here." "What's the use of getting cured on this desert?" "Don't give up, John. Oh, you're thinking there will be no more Elk Club balls." She took his arm and smiled derisively. "Yes, maybe—" "And all the Susies and Mabels and Evelyns were left behind. Too bad." "Ah, cut it. We've got to figure out something." The guards were not unkind, but herded them like cattle, impersonally and silently. The great steel door clanged, and they were able to remove their helmets in the air-conditioned interior. The strange crowd of the banished drew together in a vast open cave, dimly lighted by weak electric globes. In the distance they could hear the throbbing of an old-fashioned generator. Dr. Henderson stood on an overturned packing case with one of the primitive sound amplifiers set before him. He spoke calmly now, more at ease than at home, as if relieved. "Men and women," he began, "we are not here to harm you. This great experiment is being conducted in the interests of humanity. The constant presence of the sick is disturbing to eugenic controls and ideals. The leader and the Earth Council have wisely established this colony. You will still be treated by the best of our skill. Any who recover will be placed in an isolated and independent colony. The slightly crippled will be given handicraft and factory tasks. Their products will be shipped to Earth and sold to maintain the supply line." "Where do we live?" blurted a portly, middle-aged man near John. "There are separated quarters a few miles down the passage. Of course, rather primitive, but you can make yourselves fairly comfortable." Hilda noticed one of the nurses standing near the doctor. Her tightly waved blonde hair was gleaming in the dim light near the speaker's improvised platform. Her large blue eyes were slightly closed and her full red lips sagged almost hopelessly, but she was strikingly beautiful, with strong, clean-cut features and clear skin. Beyond were other nurses and doctors in white uniforms, scattered like lonely ghosts among the 500 and more patients. Hilda wondered what had induced these people to voluntarily leave the comforts of civilization. Were they derelicts of time, idealists, or just out of work? "There is one difference in this colony," went on Dr. Henderson in a lower tone. "If any of you find it too difficult to exist under the new conditions, euthanasia will be permitted. A sleeping pill in the white room, and your troubles are over." "Yeah, and the state saves money," snarled the white-faced man who had rebelled at the hospital entrance before them. "It will be purely voluntary," said Dr. Henderson calmly.
"Oh, I bet they'll use hypnotics," whispered Hilda in a shocked voice. "They'll make them want to. Oh, what a twisted code of ethics! They don't dare face their own attitudes. Such hypocrisy! Why not just line us up and use the ray guns?"
Dr. Henderson ended his address with the additional promises and stepped down. In a few minutes the crowd was broken up into small units. John and Hilda walked with the group of alcoholics and arrested mental cases. They began to talk and sought acquaintanceship to cancel fear. It was almost a relief to leave the congregation of pain behind them. There was only one doctor with this group, old Dr. Smithson, a retired psychiatrist who had begun working at the district hospital after losing his fortune in the stock market. He was now too old for general practice. His thin, bent shoulders straightened as he walked. His words became crisp and cheerful, as if he welcomed the adventure. With him were two nurses, Mary, the blonde girl Hilda had noticed, and a little red-headed, freckled-faced woman of indeterminate years. Near Hilda and John walked Major Henry Matson, a psychiatric casualty of the War of 1960, seemingly cured. The rebellious one, twice noticed by the reporters before, walked ahead. He said his name was Tony Pacina. A tall, white-haired man with thick glasses, recently cured of a cataract, introduced himself as Mark Hemingway, and said that he was a chemist and had been in the surgery at the hospital for his operation because of confidence in Dr. Henderson. If this should prove true, his accidental presence might be helpful. Around them were the others they would seek to know later. The group tramped briskly behind Dr. Smithson. They were the cured ones. With health, happiness is possible anywhere. They felt themselves beginning a strange comradeship, even cheerfulness.
"I wonder where they're taking us,"
said Hilda, clinging to John's arm to keep up with the brisk pace, and laughing at the way a little jump could lift her up and far ahead. "I wonder, too. Well, honey, if I must be cast away, I'm glad it's with you." She squeezed his arm, but said nothing. There was a light ahead at the end of the long tunnel. They entered a large open chamber. It was not a luxurious room, but neither was it a prison. There was sufficient heat, and the mattresses and sheets were clean. There were 2 showers and bathrooms beyond, but no ultraviolet equipment. Cloth curtains were hung to drop around their heads. One side of the room was lined halfway to the ceiling with frayed and battered books. One wall had a moving picture screen. There was no television. One noted the absence of buttons to push and gadgets for speed and comfort. There were no sliding floors. "Now our legs will ache with all the walking in this city," said Hilda rather doubtfully. "I'll like that. I'd enjoy developing a little muscle again." "I wonder where those passages go. Do you suppose they'll permit us to go out?" "Let's see." As they stepped to the door, Mary came forward and gave them each a folded paper map and a double holster holding a radylite and a gas pellet gun. Hilda buckled hers on, laughing at its weight. John stared at his thoughtfully. "No real danger here," said the blonde nurse. "But our instruction manuals say there are Mars rats, something like the jackrabbits on western sage plains back home. They run around the cave area. Nothing larger has been left in the passages. They aren't very good to eat, so we just gas them and leave them to recover. Dr. Henderson wants a reserve food supply in case of emergency. They're about twice the size of rabbits back home, and their bite is infectious. If you go beyond any of the air doors, you may need oxygen helmets. The atmosphere is pretty thin. It will take you a bit of time to get used to the lighter gravity, but that's sort of fun." She said it all with the professional cheeriness, as if it were memorized, but she paid very little attention to them. "Want to come along?" asked John. "Sorry, I have to stay here and help Dr. Smithson. I'd like to, maybe another time. We're both on duty today." She smiled, and the settled sadness of her face was gone for a moment. "Well, thanks," said John, unfolding his map slowly. "Oh, yes," she added. "And never go beyond sight of the entrance if you go out on the desert. You can see for miles, even though the horizon is nearer up there. If danger comes, you can make it back to the door easily. But there are very unpleasant things on this planet. The safety is all underground. Maybe you'd better have one of the manuals. It will be light outside and you can read." She took a thin booklet from the bundle of papers in her hand and gave it to Hilda, then walked briskly away. They pushed open the room door and stepped cautiously down a dry, dark passageway. Old marks of ray blast on the sandstone walls showed that all this underground world was artificial. Red desert sand underfoot was hard, dry, and clean. "Oh, John, it does seem good to be by ourselves again. All these sick folks depress me." "Yes, and what depresses me is how I'm going to get you back to Earth, maybe months before another ship comes. And they won't dare let us go back and tell until the experiment is well established." He folded the map carefully. "Think of all the hundreds of families back home who must be frantic." John's voice was savage as he answered. "I found out a bit about that from the mayor. Seems that every family got a printed letter, telling about the new colony and claiming it was mostly for the good of the patients. There was a systemic health propaganda plan to follow that up, conditioning the minds of their relatives to the undertaking and all its implications. I believe the patients are even allowed to write letters, censored of course, and delivered once in 2 years. You know there's no radio contact." They walked on, in an understanding silence, until she took his arm and indicated a great copper door. "Look, John, on the map it says that door 101 is an outside entrance. Let's go and see." They adjusted helmets and manipulated the manual locks of the double doors, some with experiment. John finally convinced himself that he could re-enter without difficulty. Then the 2 Earth people stepped out into a weird atmosphere under a strangely small sun. The sky was dark blue, tending toward black. Stars glittered, though it was still day. Their helmets provided a mixture of oxygen with the planet's natural atmosphere. "It's like a dream, John." The hills were old and worn out, but there were no trees. Deep shadows folded into the distance in the cold slanting sunlight, tracing sandy curves with velvet-like smoothness. John answered her thought. "Those vivid colors and deceptive distances remind me of my boyhood in Idaho. I'll bet there's the same difference between light and shade, too." Let's step into that shadow of that rock and see if it isn't suddenly much cooler. He led her to a pyramid-like rock projecting about 20 feet out of the sand and casting a shadow toward them. Hilda exclaimed, "Yes, it is colder. Why?" "The thin air always diffuses heat less than moist, heavy air near the sea and at lower altitude. I'll bet on a cold day you could get frozen out of the sunlight before you realized."
"And there are no clouds. What a strange dark sky."
"I've read that there are often yellowish clouds of dust, but only at night. When the cold comes with sunset, that moisture clouds are formed. Nights are too cold for human existence without special protection."
She shivered. "I'd get to hate that sky after a time. It's pitiless."
"You certainly would if you were lost on this desert."
"Let's rest a bit, John, and see what the manual has to say."
"Fine. We can lean our backs against this rock."
"And we'd better get on the sunny side of it."
They walked around the rock and slid down to the hard sand. Faint twists of sand curled around the sides of the rock, but they were sheltered from the wind, and out of sight of the entrance as if in a world of their own. She rested her head on his shoulder contentedly as he turned the old, crudely typeset pages of the manual. There were pen and ink illustrations of strange beasts, but no chapters on inhabitants.
"We're the only people here," said Hilda in an odd tone.
"Regular Adam and Eve picnic with clothes on."
"I'd hate to be without clothes on this desert. No garden here."
"That's right. No place for a nudist colony on Mars."
She sat up suddenly, looking past the rock at a distant shadow. Her face grew pale, and she whispered fearfully, "Look, John. There's something moving over by those rocks." He leapt to his feet.
"Yes, that's a Mars coyote. I noticed a picture on page 3. Harmless, I guess, but we'd better get back. It's close. We should have been watching." They rose hastily and walked around the boulder back toward the entrance. Hilda started and stifled a scream as they left the shelter. John drew his clumsy gas gun and stepped in front of her. Before them, on the red stretch of sand toward the entrance, were hundreds of the reddish-gray, smooth-haired animals with pointed noses and wickedly gleaming eyes. They moved back silently as the two humans approached, but only a little way.
"The book says they're cowardly," she gasped. "But there are so many."
"Too damn many. Wonder if I ought to shoot one to keep the others away." The red-gray circle bent away from them slowly as they walked steadily across the weirdly shadowed sand toward the gleaming metal door, so far ahead. The animals massed thickly before them, and were finally crowded up against the cliff in its door. They slid out sidewise but tumbled into each other. One made a dash forward, but John dropped it with the little gas pellet that broke against its hide with a stinking yellow cloud of gas. There was also an injection of paralysis fluid from the plastic point of the pellet. The little gun made no noise as it was operated by spring. John levered another pellet into the firing tube. After the yellow gas had blown away in the strong wind, the red-gray bodies crept toward their fallen comrade and suddenly rushed in, with horrible clicking of teeth and fierce, silent ripping of flesh.
"Oh!" cried Hilda. "And it's still alive! They're eating it alive!"
"Not much difference," grunted John as he aimed and fired rapidly at 3 more. Then he led her around the circle of rolling, crowding bodies. One coyote at the edge of the circle howled dismally. There were still a dozen or more between them and the door. John tried a new trick. He shot one of the beasts and ran quickly forward with his radalite in the cliff's shadow, frightening the others back. Then, while Hilda held her gun ready, he quickly scooped up the fallen coyote by its bushy tail and whirled it round his head to heave it far out over the milling mass of hungry bodies. Each hairy carcass felt unbelievably light to him, and he could cast them 30 feet away. When most of the coyotes were facing the living food away from the door, John dragged her toward the great copper portal, shooting as they ran. The lighter gravity made the work fairly easy, but even so, he was sweating and his hands trembled as he seized the last one and tossed it into the air. Hilda was fumbling with the door. "Let me do it," he gasped. "I remember—" Just then a shadow fell over them, and they were so startled as to look up from the door and step back. About 50 feet in the air hovered a small, almost spherical airboat, with no visible means of suspension or power. A port slid open on its underside, and a square black muzzle pointed at them. Hilda seized John's arm in terror as they felt themselves lifted by invisible force from the ground, above the great pack of startled coyotes. John noticed that the beasts were looking up, and many of them yelping as they ran into the rubble of rocks beyond the cliff. There wasn't time to see how many fled, for he and Hilda were quickly sucked up into the open port by invisible tractor rays. The metal hull clanged shut, and they were thrown roughly on a hard floor. John had a blurred vision of a circle of white, long-bearded faces on slender-bodied old men, before a gleaming mirror-like reflector dazzled him, and he felt his hold on reality slipping. He struggled to his feet and reached for one of the old men, managing to seize a tangled, silky beard before he fell forward into darkness.